and we run them in that order. So what does each one do? So if we start with the initial template, so that's a CloudFormation template that creates three things. One is a KMS key. So that's used by the target accounts to get access to deployment archives and assets. And it's also used by the pipeline account to encrypt assets so that we've got security between the accounts. And it also creates a commit bucket in S3. So that's just an initial commit. And that allows us to actually, as we're deploying the initial architecture and the actual infrastructure, it allows us to do a lot more than just deploy just the infrastructure itself. It lets us actually create the initial target outcome as well, so we can deploy the base infrastructure, the pipeline, the ability for us to actually submit new components into the target infrastructure.
Because you've got a repo.
Because we've got a repository. But this initial commit allows us to actually pre-populate that initial repository so that as we're building out the infrastructure in the first place, the outcome is already not just the pipeline, but the initial state of the target deployment. So we can actually, in one hit, create a sample deployment.
Yeah. But equally, if we've got a library,
that's right,
the library gets deployed as part of that initial commit.
That's it. And that's exactly the point. So
yeah.
we'll have, we've got sample templates that get us close to what a client might want. So we'll have some SAP-based components. We can have some workforce components, Oracle, and Salesforce, whoever.
Yeah.
And we can choose from our library what items, and we've even got some, basic, kind of hello world. We just need an API to be deployed.
Yeah.
That we'll then do something with. So we've got a library of components that we can then deploy as part of that initial setting up of the infrastructure and landscape in the first place, so that we've got something for the client that's a start point of how we move forward and actually build out their final landscape.
Mm-hmm.
So with that initial CloudFormation template, we create that initial commit bucket, but we also create an artifact, if I can spell it, artifact bucket. And that artifact bucket acts as the store for our code commit repository. So it's not the repository itself, it's just where our artifacts that are being built are stored for use within the pipeline as the pipeline runs. So that's that first part. And we take those outputs from that as inputs to the next and sequential CloudFormation templates. So the next thing to deploy then is in the target accounts, so that's dev, quas, prod, and it's the same template in each account. And what we're deploying with that are some IAM roles that essentially allow CloudFormation to run, and they allow the pipeline account to assume a role in the target accounts. So it creates a cross-account trust. So we create a cross-account trust between a pipeline account where all of our artifacts are stored and deployed, where the infrastructure itself to deploy our landscapes exists. That's all in a pipeline account. So if I look at the accounts structure, we've got a pipeline account, and then we'll have dev, quas, and prod. And we stick to that because it's nice to have a kind of
But we could have more depending on the client needs.
Exactly, and that's really easy to do. It's just about copying and pasting within those initial CloudFormation templates and adjusting a few things to make sure we've got the right accounts.
Mm-hmm.
But that's our kind of standard approach. Is from an enterprise perspective, we've got a pipeline account that segregates everything that we do to manage the CI/CD as separate from the actual target deployment accounts of dev, quas, and prod. So everything that we commit gets committed into the pipeline account, and that pipeline account then, through cross-account trusts into these accounts, deals with the individual deployments of our infrastructure.
And ultimately,
stages
like
in there
the repository lives in the pipeline account.
That's
So
right.
developers don't get access to the actual underlying data that might be sitting in the production environment, for example.
Exactly, and we can create, as part of that pipeline deployment, we can create IAM roles in those accounts and allow the development team the right access and the right systems to do things like monitor CloudWatch logs, things like that. But they don't need full access, and nor do they need to have direct access necessarily. We can just have some developers that their role entirely is encompassed through building code, adding code in there to deploy automatic testing.
Yeah.
So back to those CloudFormation templates. So that second template that goes into the target accounts creates IAM roles for cross-account trusts, CloudFormation roles, and deployment roles. So there's a small number of things in that. Then in the sequence, and you know, it's possible to join some of these templates together in a more complex architecture, but I find it's helpful, and so far we've found it really useful to keep these separated, because we get a clear, we get a clear structure for the way that we initially set a client up, and it lets us do some interesting things. And the next thing is this, specifically, that by keeping these as separate CloudFormation templates without creating large stacks, we can stop at this point, having done the initial CloudFormation template in the pipeline account and that secondary target account deployment. We can then, at the step 3, go back to the pipeline account, and now that we've created that initial commit bucket, we can choose from one of our pre-packaged starter templates. We can add that as a zip file into our initial commit bucket. Once that's done, and it's just a zip file, and that zip file contains itself another CloudFormation template and all the code and declarations needed to deploy an infrastructure as code deployment to each of those target accounts in exactly the same way. So once we've done that, and that's just an upload, then we go back to, again within the pipeline account, we execute the pipeline CloudFormation template, and that creates our initial infrastructure that starts with IAM roles to support CloudFormation, code build, code deploy, and code pipeline. We create the code repo, and as part of that code repo creation, the act of creating the code repository calls upon that initial commit bucket to see if there is an initial deployment. And because there is one, the code repository creates an initial commit. And then we use CloudWatch. We use CloudWatch rules to create triggers against the code repo, so that when a commit has been made against the code repository, we use CloudWatch events, CloudWatch rules to then trigger the pipeline. So
it triggers code build and CloudFormation.
That's right, and we do this in two steps. So obviously, as part of this template, we're actually building the pipeline, but we'll start with that template itself defines code build, and it defines a code build project based on AWS standard templates and the kind of Linux repositories. So we're not actually deploying any servers; we're deploying effectively a container. But that is a managed container, managed by AWS. We're just consuming it whenever and only whenever we're actually running a pipeline. So if we're actually doing something, it spins up into existence, we use it, and we do a build. And all that the build does, in fact, is allows us to utilize some scripted commands. So we do that in the code build YAML that we supply within that initial commit. And the code build YAML declares that actually what we want to do is run some CloudFormation commands. And the CloudFormation commands really are only to take our template, take the code that we've deployed in that initial commit or in any other commit from that point forward, zip those up into an AWS SAM deployment, and create, actually run the CloudFormation template formation so that we create the actual output templates. So when we're deploying, we'll use AWS SAM, which allows us to we've got a kind of an abbreviated way of creating CloudFormation resources, and the CloudFormation commands that we execute in code build unpack that and form the actual CloudFormation template that will be then deployed. So the code build step creates an output, and that output consists of our zip files for upload for things like Lambda functions and the actual code, and it also creates our output templates that CloudFormation activities will then run on. So we have the next step in the chain of code pipeline, then allows us to run a CloudFormation stack creation, and we create a change set, and then the second step of that is that we deploy the change set, and that deployment of the change set occurs first in the dev account using assumed role from the dev account, and then we'll have SNS based approvals. So as part of that deployment, we're actually creating SNS topics with pre-subscriptions for the Nano team for the approvers. So code build automatically runs.
Or for the client too.
Or for the client. Well, I mean, that's in the later stage.
In the later stage, yeah.
But in the development,
yeah,
we will automatically deploy to dev. Then we'll have an approval step based on a simple notification service where we'll email our internal approvers. So testing can occur in dev, and if that's okay, we'll approve the build to quaz. And at that point, the pipeline just automatically starts again with the approval step, a manual approval step, and we'll build. We repeat the build step, we repeat the CloudFormation stack create and change set create and change set deploy. We repeat those activities then in quaz, and then we'll have another manual approval step. And at that point, that manual approval step with emails, generally speaking, includes client representatives as well. So, if the client is okay with us approving initially to production or to quality, we'll do that. But typically, at the point at which we get between quaz and prod, that's the point at which it's client responsibility to actually sign off on the deployment, and we'll let the client approve to production.
So from start to end, that 1, 2, 3, and then obviously 4, that entire deployment cycle, how long does that take to run?
So that initial, the creation of the KMS key takes a little bit of time. So that initial template, although it's very small, takes about 4 minutes.
Yeah.
The deployment in the target accounts, each one takes 2 to 3 minutes. The deployment of the zip is, a minute. And the deployment of that pipeline, although it's a much larger stack, a lot of the work's been done, a lot of the costly work has been done. So that stack takes itself again around 2 to 3 minutes. So if you look at the worst case scenario, so 6, 10, 11 minutes, and that's the entire initial deployment done with packaged deployment that then runs in another kind of 5 minutes or so, and you've got your initial target set up done for the client, from which point you can then start building out the rest of the environment.
So you can do additional commits against the repo and then make changes to that base code.
Yeah.
So from start to end, that takes less time than it took for you to explain how it all works.
Yep.